The landing gear on Flight 1143 had a sound. Not the hydraulic groan everyone notices, that heavy mechanical sigh when the wheels deploy and the cabin fills with nervous coughers and phone clutchers. No, I'm talking about a subtler thing, a vibration that traveled through the airframe at a specific frequency, and if you pressed your palm flat against the fuselage wall in the aft galley, right where the service door meets the insulation panel, you could feel it in your wrist bones before you heard it in your ears. 3 pulses, then a sustained hum, then silence. Every aircraft has its own signature. After 11 years working regional routes for Piedmont Express, I knew them the way a mechanic knows engine knocks. By feel, by intuition, by the particular music of metal doing what metal was asked to do. It was 6:14 p.m. on October 9th, and I was standing in that exact spot, palm against the wall. Not because I was checking the gear, but because I was hiding from the passenger in seat 14C who had pressed the call button 9 times in 2 hours. 9. I'd been counting. The aft galley smelled like reheated lasagna and the dregs of the second coffee service. That particular airline smell that lives somewhere between a hospital cafeteria and a break room in a building where no one has opened a window since the Clinton administration. Helen, the other flight attendant working the back, had taken her break 20 minutes ago, which left me alone with 14C and his opinions about the turbulence, and whether it was normal turbulence or the kind that means something. Helen had a way of tilting her head when she was about to say something she'd regret. Not a full tilt, just 2 degrees, maybe 3, enough that her left earring would catch the overhead light. She'd been doing it all afternoon. Tilting, catching herself, straightening. I knew what it meant. It meant she was going to tell me about the voicemail from her sister, the one she'd listened to during boarding and hadn't mentioned since, the one that had put a hairline crack in her composure that she was now spackling over with professionalism and silence. I was thinking about Helen's earring and 14C's call button and the fact that I still needed to call my daughter before her bedtime. Nessa went to sleep at 8:30, and if I missed the window, she'd answer tomorrow morning with that specific quality of quiet that 14-year-olds deploy like a scalpel. The silence that means I noticed you weren't there, when Captain Erickson's voice came through the intercom. Not the PA. The crew intercom, the handset in the galley that passengers can't hear. I picked it up and he said, "Lena, come to the flight deck." Erickson had flown B-52s for the Air Force before he'd come to commercial aviation. He did not waste words the way civilian pilots sometimes did. No folksy drawl, no hey, when you get a minute. When Erickson said come to the flight deck, you went to the flight deck. But there was something else in his voice, a thinness, as though the words had been passed through a filter that had removed a frequency I was used to hearing. The confidence frequency, the one that tells you the person speaking has more information than you and is comfortable with that asymmetry. I walked up the aisle. The cabin was dim. We'd lowered the lights for the evening segment, Charlotte to Chicago. 97 passengers and a woman in 7A who was flying with an emotional support cat in a carrier that the cat was deeply opposed to. The cat had been making a sound for the last hour that was less meowing and more an existential protest. A low warble that passengers near it had stopped noticing and passengers far from it kept craning their necks to identify. The plane smelled like recycled air and hand sanitizer and the faintest trace of someone's fast food smuggled through security in a coat pocket. Normal. Everything was normal. 97 people reading, sleeping, watching seatback screens, existing in that particular airline suspension where you are nowhere. Not where you left, not where you're going, just a warm body in a pressurized tube moving at 500 miles per hour through air that would kill you in 90 seconds if the tube failed. I passed them all without looking. I knocked on the flight deck door, entered my code, and stepped inside. Erickson was in the left seat. First Officer Danish Korapati was in the right. Neither of them turned to look at me, which was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was the sound, or rather, the layering of sounds. The normal flight deck has a specific audio texture, the hum of avionics, the whisper of the autopilot servos, the occasional crackle of ATC chatter through the overhead speaker. All of that was present. But underneath it, coming from the radio, there was something else. Multiple frequencies bleeding together. Voices overlapping. Not the orderly call and response of air traffic control. This was, I don't have a better word for it, frantic. Like listening to a room where everyone is talking and no one is listening, and the conversation isn't a conversation anymore. It's just noise shaped like language. Close the door, Erickson said. I closed it. Sit down. I pulled down a jump seat and sat. Danish turned then, and his face told me what Erickson's voice had suggested. Danish was 31, the youngest first officer in our fleet, and he had the kind of composure that young men cultivate when they want to appear older than they are: measured gestures, deliberate speech, a refusal to be visibly rattled. That composure was gone. What was underneath it was not panic. It was the thing that comes before panic, the raw cognitive state where the brain has received information it hasn't yet categorized, and the face becomes a waiting room for an emotion that hasn't arrived. Chicago Center just went off frequency, Erickson said. He said it the way he said everything: flat, factual, stripped of ornamentation. But his hands were on his thighs, not on the yoke or the throttle, and his fingers were spread wide, pressing into the fabric of his uniform pants as though he were trying to keep his hand from doing something he hadn't authorized. What do you mean, off frequency? I asked. I mean, they stopped transmitting 45 minutes ago. We've been working Kansas City Center as a relay, but Kansas City is... He paused. Erickson did not pause. Kansas City is experiencing volume issues. Volume issues. Every aircraft between the Rockies and the Appalachians is trying to talk to them simultaneously, because Chicago, Minneapolis, and Indianapolis centers have all stopped responding within the last hour. I felt the jump seat's vinyl beneath my palms. I pressed my hands flat against it the way I'd press my palm against the fuselage wall, looking for the vibration, the signature, the thing I could identify and understand. The vinyl was warm from the flight deck's heating system. It told me nothing. There's more, Danish said. Erickson reached forward and adjusted the radio. The overlapping voices clarified slightly, not into coherence, but enough that I could catch fragments. A pilot requesting diversion to St. Louis. Another declaring a fuel emergency. A third, a woman's voice clipped and professional, but cracking at the edges, saying something about O'Hare, about the runways, about vehicles on the taxiways, about how she could see from her altitude that the terminal building. Erickson turned it down. Addis at O'Hare is broadcasting a recorded message, he said. The message says the airport is closed to all traffic due to a security emergency. No further information. No expected reopening time. Midway is the same. We've queried Rockford, Gary, Milwaukee, and Peoria. Rockford and Gary aren't responding. Milwaukee has a 90-minute hold and is not guaranteeing sequencing. Peoria is responding, but reporting that their single runway has been requisitioned by the National Guard. Requisitioned, I said. Her word. My phone was in my apron pocket. I could feel its weight. Nessa would be finishing homework right now. She'd be at the kitchen table in the apartment in Charlotte, the one with the window that overlooked the parking lot of the Korean grocery store, and she'd have her textbook open and her headphones in and a glass of the orange juice she liked. Not Tropicana, the store brand, because she decided at age 12 that brand loyalty was a marketing scam, and she'd committed to this position with a consistency I found both admirable and exhausting. She drew a small cat in the margin of every assignment. Her teachers had stopped commenting on it. It was just part of Nessa's work, the math, the answers, and the cat. She was staying with my mother this week while I worked the rotation. My mother's apartment was in the same building, 2 floors up. This was the arrangement. This was how it worked. This was the scaffolding of my life as a single parent with a job that put me in the sky for 3 days of stretch. Lena. Erickson's voice pulled me back. I need you to listen to something. He reached for the radio again. Switched frequencies. For a moment, static. Then a voice, not a pilot, not ATC. A voice broadcasting on an emergency frequency, which is something that does not happen outside of extraordinary circumstances. The voice belonged to someone in a control tower. I could tell by the acoustic signature, the slight echo of a windowed room high above the ground. The voice was speaking with the careful enunciation of someone who knows they are broadcasting and wants to be understood and is fighting to maintain that enunciation against something that is trying to dismantle it from the inside. All aircraft, all aircraft. This is a general broadcast on guard frequency. FAA has issued a ground stop for the continental United States, effective immediately. All airports east of the Mississippi are closed to civilian traffic. Military airfields are operating on a restricted basis. If you are currently airborne, maintain your current altitude and heading and monitor this frequency for further instructions. Do not attempt to land at any airport that has not been confirmed open by an active ATC facility. Conditions on the ground are a pause. Too long. In the background, I could hear something. Not clearly. A sound like a distant crowd, but wrong. The pitch was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. It had the quality of something organic that had been stripped of its organizing principle. Conditions on the ground are not survivable at many locations. Repeat. Ground conditions at many airports are not survivable. Maintain altitude. Wait for instructions. The transmission ended. Erickson turned the radio down. The three of us sat in the blue-dark glow of the instrument panel, 31,000 feet above the surface of the Earth, moving at 460 knots toward a city that had stopped answering. I still hear that voice when certain sounds trigger the memory. The hum of fluorescent lights, specifically. Something about the frequency. My daughter's school has fluorescent lights in the hallway, and every time I'm lucky enough to pick her up, I hear that man in the tower and the sound behind him, and my hands do the thing where they want to press flat against something solid. I let them. I don't explain. How much fuel? I asked because it was the question that mattered mechanically, and mechanics were the only thing I could contribute. 3 hours and 42 minutes at current burn rate, Danish said. We departed with full tanks because Charlotte fueling was backed up, and we took on extra rather than wait for an exact figure. Erickson's call. It might save us. 3 hours and 42 minutes. That was our lifespan. After that, we would come down regardless of what was on the ground because physics does not negotiate and jet fuel does not regenerate and gravity is the only authority that never loses its frequency. The passengers, Erickson said, they need to be managed. Managed? They have phones. They're going to start getting calls, texts, news alerts, social media. Some of them probably already have. I need you and Helen to keep that cabin from becoming a problem. A problem? Lena, I am not being evasive. I am telling you that I have limited information and 97 souls on this aircraft and 3 hours of fuel and no confirmed destination. I need the cabin stable while I work the radios. Can you give me that? Yes. Good. I stood. My knees were doing something unfamiliar. Not shaking exactly, but negotiating with my weight in a way that suggested the contract between my skeleton and my muscles was being renegotiated. I reached for the door handle. Lena. I turned. If anyone asks, and they will, the official information is that Chicago is experiencing a ground stop due to a security situation. We are diverting to an alternate airport. We expect to be on the ground within 2 hours. That is the story. Is any of that true? The ground stop is true. I stepped out of the flight deck and into the cabin, and the first thing I saw was a woman in row 6 holding her phone to her chest with both hands, the way you'd hold a wound to stop the bleeding, and her face was doing the thing that faces do when the information coming through the screen is too large to fit inside the expression the face was wearing a moment ago. She looked up at me. Her eyes asked a question. I smiled the smile I had been trained to smile, professional, reassuring, containing nothing, and walked past her. Helen was back from her break. She was standing in the aft galley, and she was holding her phone, and she was not tilting her head. She was completely still. Helen. She looked at me. Her left earring caught the light. My sister's in Indianapolis, she said. She called me before boarding. Left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it until we were in the air. She held the phone out to me, not to take, just to show. The screen displayed a voicemail timestamp, 3:47 p.m. She said something's happening at the hospital. She's a charge nurse at Methodist. She said they locked the ER doors from the inside. She said the patients in the overflow wing were, she used the word wrong. She said they were wrong. She said she couldn't explain it. She said to call her when I landed. Have you tried calling back? 17 times. I told Helen what Erickson had told me. The ground stop, the silent centers, the fuel calculation. I told her the managed version, and then, because Helen had been flying with me for 4 years, and we had developed the kind of trust that comes from sharing a workspace the size of a closet at 30,000 feet. I told her the real version. Her face received it the way a house receives a storm. The structure held, but I could see the stress in the framing. We made a plan. Or rather, we made the only thing available to us, which was a sequence of tasks that resembled a plan in the same way that bailing water resembles sailing. We would walk the cabin. We would answer questions with the authorized story. We would monitor for passengers who were receiving alarming information on their phones and intervene with calm, physical presence, a hand on a shoulder, a cup of water, the reassurance of a uniformed human being who appeared to know what was happening even though she did not. I walked the aisle. Rows 1 through 5 were quiet. Business travelers, headphones in, laptops open, occupying the particular bubble of self-containment that frequent flyers construct around themselves. If the world was ending, they would notice when it affected their connecting flight and not before. Row 6 was the woman with the phone pressed to her chest. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd thought. Mid-20s, glasses, a Purdue sweatshirt. She looked at me, and her mouth opened, and I could see the question forming, and I said, "We're diverting due to a ground stop in Chicago." Very routine. "Can I get you some water?" She shook her head. "My mom's in Naperville," she said. "She sent me a video. I'm sure there are people in the streets. They're not walking right. My mom is locked in the bathroom, and her voice clenched. Not broke, clenched, like a fist closing around something it couldn't hold. She's alone." I knelt beside her seat. I put my hand on her arm. Her skin was cold. "What's your name?" "Priya. Priya. We're going to land safely. The captain is working on our alternate right now. Whatever is happening on the ground, we are not on the ground." She nodded. She didn't believe me, and I didn't believe me, but the ritual of reassurance has its own structural integrity, its own load-bearing function, and sometimes the performance of calm is the only architecture available when the real thing has collapsed. I moved on. Rows 7 through 12. The emotional support cat had gone silent. Its owner, a thin man with a beard and a jacket that smelled like clove cigarettes and anxiety, was staring at his phone with the expression of someone reading their own autopsy report. Around him, a slow infection of awareness was spreading. Not the biological kind, not yet, but the informational kind. I could track it by the posture changes. A person who was relaxed 2 minutes ago was now sitting forward. A person who was sleeping was now awake, disturbed by the shift in the cabin's emotional barometric pressure. Phones were coming out of pockets. Screens were lighting up. Row 14. 14C. The man who had pressed his call button 9 times. He was a large man, mid-50s, wearing a polo shirt with a logo from a roofing company in Raleigh. He looked up at me and said, "Miss, I'm going to need you to explain what's happening. We're experiencing a ground stop at O'Hare, sir. We're diverting to..." I've been on 100 flights. A ground stop doesn't make the pilot go quiet for 40 minutes. And my son just texted me from Fort Bragg. Excuse me, Fort Liberty. And he says his unit is deploying. Not overseas. Deploying domestic. You want to explain that? I do not want to explain that. I cannot explain that. What I could do was look at this man, whose name I would learn was Glenn Turley, who owned that roofing company and had hands like catcher's mitts and a voice built for yelling over nail guns on hot rooftops, and say, "Sir, I will get you any information I can as soon as I have it. Right now, the safest thing for everyone is to stay seated and stay calm." Glenn Turley looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years solving problems by being louder and more persistent than the problem, and who has just encountered a category of problem where that approach has no purchase. He nodded. He looked at his phone again. His thumbs moved over the screen, and I could see the text he was composing. "Stay on base. Do not come home. I love you." I kept walking. Row 19. A woman traveling with 2 children, a boy of maybe 7 and a girl of maybe 10. The children were watching a movie on a shared tablet, splitting a pair of earbuds, 1 bud each, their heads tilted toward each other at complementary angles. The woman was not watching a movie. She was watching me. She had the focused, calibrated attention of someone who has learned to read situations before they develop, The way parents of young children learn to read the trajectory of a thrown ball or the wobble of a stacked tower of blocks. She knew something was wrong. She had known before I walked into the aisle. She knew because she had been listening to the engines, and the engines hadn't changed, but the cabin crew's walking pace had. And that asymmetry was information. "Ma'am," I said, and then I didn't know what to say after that, because the authorized story felt increasingly like a sandcastle and the tide was visible. "I know," she said. Quiet. Controlled. Her children didn't look up from their tablet. "My husband is a controller at Indianapolis Center. He stopped responding 40 minutes ago." "I know." Her name was Grace Okoro. I would come to know her well over the next 11 hours. I would come to depend on her in ways that would have been unimaginable to me at that moment. Standing in the aisle of a regional jet with the world coming apart beneath us like ice over dark water. But right then, in that moment, she was simply a woman whose composure was more terrifying than another person's panic. Because composure in the face of catastrophe means the person has already leaped ahead to the implications and landed on the other side, and is now looking back at you from a place you haven't reached yet. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need the cabin to stay calm." Then you should know that the man in 23D is about to lose it. He's been on the phone with someone in Cincinnati, and the call dropped, and he's been dialing and redialing, and his breathing is wrong. Also, the older couple in row 8. The woman is a retired nurse, and she's already figured out, and she's whispering to her husband, and he's looking at the emergency exits. Handle those two situations, and you buy yourself 20 minutes. She said this with the clinical precision of an air traffic controller spouse, someone who had absorbed, through proximity and pillow talk and years of ambient expertise, the language of managing multiple variables in a confined space. I looked at her and felt something shift. Not in the situation, which was beyond shifting, but in my assessment of the resources available. Grace Okoro was a resource. "Thank you," I said. I handled 23D. His name was Marcus. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative from Cincinnati, and his wife had called him from their house in Sharonville to tell him that something had come through their neighborhood. She didn't say what. She said something, and the word had the shape of a container that was holding more than it was designed for. And she had taken their daughter to the basement and locked the door, and then the call had dropped and Marcus had been redialing for 16 minutes. His hands were shaking so badly that he kept mistyping the number. I knelt beside him. I didn't touch him. Some people need touch, and some people need space, and Marcus needed space because the shaking was the only thing keeping him from screaming, and if I interrupted it, the scream would come. "Marcus, I need you to breathe. In through your nose. Can you do that?" He did it. Once. Twice. On the third breath, something in his chest unlocked. Not calm, not acceptance, but a structural shift from panic to function. He looked at me. "My daughter's name is Iris," he said. "She's 4. That's a beautiful name. She's afraid of basements." I didn't have an answer for that. There was no trained response for a father telling you his 4-year-old daughter was afraid of the place that might be keeping her alive. I stayed with him for a moment longer than I should have, and then I moved on, because the plane was a system, and systems require attention distributed across all nodes, not concentrated on the ones that hurt the most. I handled row 8. The retired nurse, her name was Dolores, had indeed figured it out, and she was whispering to her husband Albert with the specific urgency of someone who has worked emergency medicine and recognizes the pattern even when the pattern is unprecedented. I told her the truth. Not the full truth, not the GAR broadcast or the fuel clock, but enough. I told her the ground was compromised and we were looking for somewhere to land, and I needed her help keeping the medical situation in the cabin stable if it came to that. She nodded once, and her whispered conversation with Albert shifted from what's happening to what do we do, which was the shift I needed. 80 minutes passed. They passed in the particular way that time passes when every minute contains the same density of dread. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a viscous quality, like swimming through something thicker than air. I walked the aisle. I poured water. I smiled. I lied. Helen worked the back of the cabin with the same manufactured calm. And between us we kept the pressure below the threshold, though the threshold was lowering with every phone call that failed to connect, and every text that went undelivered, and every news alert that made someone's face change. The radios had become worse. I made 2 more trips to the flight deck, each time receiving information that was smaller in quantity and larger in implication. The FAA's ground stop had expanded to include the entire country. Military airfields were accepting flights on a case-by-case basis, but the case-by-case process required communication with facilities that were increasingly not communicating. Erickson had made contact with Scott Air Force Base outside St. Louis, and they had tentatively agreed to accept us, but then Scott had gone silent mid-sentence, and Erickson had spent the next 30 minutes trying to re-establish contact and failing. Our fuel window was now 2 hours and 11 minutes. Danish had tuned the secondary radio to civilian AM frequencies, which was unorthodox but not prohibited, and through the static we caught fragments. A station in Des Moines broadcasting what sounded like an automated loop: "Stay indoors. Do not approach anyone exhibiting erratic behavior. Avoid physical contact." This is not a drill. A station in St. Louis that was still live. A man's voice, not a professional broadcaster. Someone who had gotten to the microphone after the professionals had left or died or locked themselves in, describing what he could see from the station's window in a voice that was halfway between reporting and praying. He said the streets were full. He said they were moving east toward the river. He said the bridges were jammed with cars, and the cars weren't moving, and the people in the cars were. Erickson turned it off. "How about someone?" he said. The radio crackled. A voice, female, tired, hoarse, but alive and organized, identifying herself as a controller at Whiteman Air Force Base in western Missouri. She said the base was operational. She said they were accepting civilian aircraft on an emergency basis. She said the runway was clear, but she could not guarantee ground conditions beyond the perimeter fence. She said we would need to declare a fuel emergency to be prioritized. "Done," Erickson said, and pressed the transmit button, and in a voice that contained not one fluctuation, said the words that I had heard in training but never in practice. "Whiteman Tower, Piedmont Express 1143. We are declaring a fuel emergency. 97 souls on board. Request immediate approach and landing clearance." Clearance was given. Erickson began the descent. I went back to the cabin and made the PA announcement. I said we were diverting to an alternate airport due to the ground stop. I said we expected to be on the ground in approximately 40 minutes. I said please ensure your seat belts were fastened and your tray tables were secured and your seats were in the upright position. I said the words I'd said 1,000 times, the liturgy of commercial aviation, and they came out of my mouth with the mechanical fluency of a prayer recited so many times it has been separated from its meaning and exists now as pure sound, pure structure, pure ritual. Priya in row 6 was crying without sound. Glenn Turley in 14C was gripping the armrests with hands that could bend aluminum. Grace Okoro's children were still watching their movie. Marcus in 23D was holding his phone with both hands, and his lips were moving, not speaking, not praying, something in between. The emotional support cat had resumed its protest. The cabin smelled like fear and recycled air, and the lasagna that now seemed like an artifact from a civilization I had been a member of 2 hours ago. We descended through 20,000 feet. 15. 10. At 8,000 feet, Danish said, "I have visual on the base." At 6,000 feet, he said, "Runway is clear." At 4,000 feet, he said, "There's activity along the eastern fence line." Erickson said, "Define activity." Danish was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time. 3 seconds, when you're descending toward the ground at 140 knots and someone has just used the word activity to describe something they can see but not yet classify, is an epic. "People," Danish said. "A lot of people. Along the fence. They're pressing against it. The fence is another pause. Some sections are down. Runway status. Runway appears clear. But the Easter taxiway has vehicles on it. Military vehicles. Some of them aren't moving." Erickson made a sound. Not a word. A sound that a man makes when he is recalculating every variable simultaneously and the math is not cooperative. Then he said, "We're committed. We land. We landed. The landing itself was technically perfect. Erickson greased it onto the numbers. The thrust reversers deployed, the brakes engaged, and the aircraft decelerated with the textbook precision of a man who had landed bombers on shorter runways in worse conditions. The passengers applauded. People always applaud a landing. I have never understood it, and I have never resented it as much as I did in that moment. That reflexive social gesture, that muscle memory of normalcy, because what I could see through the galley window was not something that warranted applause. The base was partially overrun. Not fully. The western half appeared intact, with lights and vehicles and the organized movement of military personnel. But the eastern perimeter was breached. The fence had failed in at least 3 places, and through those gaps, figures were moving. Even from a distance, even through the small oval of the galley window, I could see that the movement was wrong. Not in the way movies had taught me to expect. Not slow, not shuffling, not the Hollywood lurch. These figures moved with a terrible, purposeless efficiency, like automated systems executing a program that no longer had a valid objective. They moved in straight lines until they encountered an obstacle, and then they adjusted, not intelligently, not tactically, but with a mechanical fluidity that suggested the body had been liberated from the brain's oversight and was now operating on something older, something deeper, something that lived in the brainstem, where instinct is indistinguishable from reflex. The aircraft taxied toward the western side of the base. A military vehicle, a Humvee with a soldier standing in the turret, escorted us, staying parallel to our left wing. The soldier was facing east toward the breached fence, and the weapon mounted on the turret was oriented in the same direction. This was not a welcoming committee. This was a defensive escort. We stopped on a taxiway near a cluster of hangars. The engine spooled down. The auxiliary power unit hummed to life. And then, for a moment that lasted either 5 seconds or 5 years, everything was still. Erickson's voice came through the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at a military airfield in Missouri. We will be deplaning shortly. I want to thank you for your patience and compliance during this diversion. Please remain seated until the cabin crew opens the doors. And he paused. The first pause he'd made over the PA in the entire flight. Stay together. Those 2 words. Stay together. They were not in any script. They were not in any manual. They were the words of a man who could see what I could see through the flight deck windows, and who had chosen to compress everything he knew into 2 syllables that meant, the world outside this aircraft is not the world you left. The door opened. The air that came in was October cold and smelled like jet exhaust and grass and something else. Something chemical and biological simultaneously, a sweetness that had no business existing alongside the smell of a military runway. It was faint. I would learn to recognize it. I would learn that it preceded their proximity the way ozone precedes lightning, a chemical announcement, a warning encoded in molecules. We deplaned onto the tarmac. 97 passengers, 2 flight attendants, 2 pilots. 101 people standing in the early dark of a Missouri evening on a military base that was in the process of contracting, pulling its resources and personnel westward, away from the breached fence, consolidating into a defensible perimeter that was getting smaller by the hour. A staff sergeant named Wynn met us. She was maybe 25, with a voice that had been compressed by 12 hours of continuous crisis into something dense and efficient. Every word load-bearing, no filler, no courtesy. You're in hangar 4. Food and water have been staged. Do not leave the hangar. Do not approach the eastern perimeter. If you hear gunfire, get low and stay low. If you hear the siren, one long blast, move to the underground shelter beneath the hangar. The access is through the floor hatch in the northwest corner. Do you have medical personnel among your passengers? A retired nurse, I said. She's now an active nurse. Send her to the medical station in Hangar 2. We have casualties. What's happening? I asked, and the question felt both necessary and absurd, like asking the name of the hurricane while it takes your roof. Wynn looked at me. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been given information that has restructured her understanding of the world and who has not yet had time to build a new structure to replace the old one. She was operating in the gap, the free fall between frameworks, and she was doing it with the discipline of her training and the adrenaline of her youth and nothing else. "We don't have a complete picture," she said. "What we know is that every major population center east of the Mississippi is compromised. The infection, they're calling it an infection, spreads through fluid contact. Bites mostly. The incubation period is between 4 and 90 minutes, depending on the bite location and the individual. Once turned, they are not recoverable. The DoD has authorized lethal force. That's what you need to know. Get your people in the hangar." I got my people in the hangar. Hangar 4 was cavernous, cold, and lit by the kind of industrial fixtures that turn human skin the color of old paper. It smelled like motor oil and concrete dust and the ghost of the aircraft that had last been maintained there. Someone, Wynn's people presumably, had laid out cots in rows, military blankets folded at the foot of each one, and against the far wall, a table held cases of water bottles, MREs, and a first aid kit that looked woefully calibrated for a different scale of problem. I watched 97 people file into that hangar and begin the process of understanding that they were not going to make their connecting flights, that they were not going to call an Uber, that the hotel reservations and the business meetings and the birthday parties and the funerals and the weddings and the simple, taken for granted arrivals that had been waiting for them at the other end of this flight were now on the other side of a line that might never be crossable again. Priya sat on a cot and called her mother. The call didn't connect. She dialed again. She would dial 31 times over the next 3 hours. I know because I counted the way I'd counted 14 C's called button presses because counting was the only form of control available to me. Glenn Turley stood near the hangar door and watched the eastern horizon, where the floodlights along the base perimeter created a white-yellow boundary between the organized world and the disorganized one. Occasionally, in the distance, a sound would reach us. Not gunfire, not screaming, but something in between, a percussive irregularity that the brain wanted to classify, but couldn't, like hearing a word in a language you almost speak. Grace Okoro settled her children on adjacent cots and produced, from her carry-on bag, a sleeve of Ritz crackers and a jar of Jif peanut butter and a plastic knife. She made them each a cracker sandwich with the methodical calm of someone performing a sacrament. Her boy ate his immediately. Her girl held hers and looked at her mother and said, "Is Daddy coming?" Grace said, "Eat your cracker, baby." Marcus sat on the floor against the wall, his phone in his lap, its screen dark. He was not dialing anymore. He was holding a butterscotch candy. I watched him unwrap it, hold it, roll it between his fingers, and then he put it in his shirt pocket without eating it and stared at the hangar ceiling and breathed. Helen stood beside me. We were in the doorway, half inside and half out, occupying the boundary between our passengers and the base, between our responsibility and our helplessness. "My sister," Helen said. "I know. She has 2 kids, 7 and 9. Their names are Caleb and Joy." I didn't say it would be okay. Helen would have heard the lie in it the way a musician hears a wrong note. Instead, I said, "Tell me about Joy." Helen tilted her head. The earring caught the floodlight. "She wants to be an astronaut. She tells everyone. The cashier at Kroger, the mailman, strangers in elevators. She has a speech prepared. It's very detailed. It includes a timeline. That's a good plan. She'd be good at it. She's so precise. Everything in its place. She arranges her stuffed animals by size every night before bed. Every night. Even when she's sick. Even when she's tired." We stood there. The wind came across the runway, carrying that chemical sweetness and the distant sound of the fence line and the vast Missouri dark. Above us, a plane, another diverted flight, appeared in the sky, its landing lights cutting through the darkness like 2 bright, desperate eyes searching for the ground. The first night was long in the way that certain experiences are long. Not by the clock, which moved with its usual mechanical indifference, but by the density of what each hour contained. More planes landed. The hangar filled. By midnight, there were over 300 people in a space designed for aircraft maintenance, and the air had acquired the thick, human smell of concentrated anxiety and unwashed bodies and the MRE chili that someone had heated using the chemical warmer and which smelled. I'm not exaggerating. Exactly like the end of the world would smell if the end of the world had a commissary. I did not sleep. Helen did not sleep. Erickson appeared briefly, spoke with Wynne, and returned to the aircraft to monitor the radios. Danish stayed with him. They became our link to the information stream, which was itself becoming thinner and more intermittent, like a river in drought. At 2 a.m., Erickson sent a message through a young airman. Indianapolis has fallen. Louisville is dark. St. Louis is contested. The Mississippi River bridges have been destroyed by military order to slow westward spread. We are on the correct side of the river. Barely. I read the message and felt the specific vertigo of understanding a sentence that rearranges geography. The Mississippi, that vast, ancient, continent-dividing waterway, was now a moat. Everything east of it was being written off. My daughter was east of it. My mother was east of it. Charlotte, North Carolina, where my apartment had a kitchen table where a 14-year-old girl drew cats in margins, was east of it. I went outside. I stood on the tarmac in the dark. The stars were obscene in their indifference, brilliant, dense, the kind of sky you only see when ground light pollution is absent, which meant the cities were dark, which meant what I knew it meant. I pressed my palm flat against the hangar wall. Cold metal. I felt for a vibration. Any vibration, the way I felt for the landing gear signature on the fuselage. The metal was still. No signature. No frequency I could identify. Just cold and darkened. The stars and the sound of the fence line, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a helicopter that might have been rescue, or might have been retreat, or might have been the last machine in the sky besides ours. I called Nessa. The call connected. It rang. Once. Twice. 6 times. The voicemail picked up. Her voice, recorded months ago, casual, slightly annoyed at the performative requirement of a voicemail greeting, said, "It's Nessa. Leave a message, or don't. I'll probably see the missed call anyway." A beep. "Baby," I said. "It's Mom. I'm on the ground. I'm safe. I need you to stay with Grandma. Lock the doors. The front door and the chain. Fill the bathtub with water. I know that sounds crazy. Do it anyway. I'm going to come get you. I don't know when, but I'm going to come get you. I need you to know that. I'm coming. I love you. Draw me a cat." I hung up. The message may have delivered. It may not have. The network was collapsing. Cell towers dropping like dominoes as their backup generators exhausted fuel, as the technicians who maintained them joined the exodus, or the infected, or the dead. My words might be sitting in a server somewhere in a data center that still has power. Or they might have reached her phone, which might be in her hand, which might be in the basement of my mother's apartment in Charlotte, behind a locked door, with a bathtub full of water and a flashlight, and a 14-year-old girl who is afraid of nothing except the specific silence that means her mother isn't calling. The next 3 days existed in a state that I've struggled to describe to the therapist they eventually assigned me. She uses the word dissociative. I use the word operational. I was operational. I operated. The distinction between those two words is the territory that therapy is trying to map, and we're not there yet. Whiteman contracted. The eastern perimeter fell on the second night. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a dam fails. Small leaks that become streams, that become breaches, that become irreversible. The infected came through in groups that grew larger and more frequent, and the base's defenders, a mix of active military, reserve units, and airmen who had been trained to maintain aircraft and not to fight in close quarters against things that used to be people, fell back and fell back and fell back. I organized. It was what I knew how to do. 11 years of managing cabins, managing fear, managing logistics, managing the gap between what people need and what is available. And it turned out that the skill set transferred. I organized the hangar into zones: sleeping, eating, medical, children. I created a rotation for water distribution. I identified the passengers with useful skills: Dolores the nurse, Glenn the roofer who understood structural integrity, a quiet man named Pal from row 27 who turned out to be an electrician and who rewired the hangar's lighting system so we could black out sections without losing all visibility. Grace Okoro became my second in command, though neither of us used that language. We simply fell into a rhythm. I handled logistics, she handled people. She had an ability to look at someone who was falling apart and say the exact sentence that gave him a handhold. Not comfort. She didn't traffic in comfort. Handholds. Things to grip. Tasks, questions, small purposes. She told a weeping man to count the water bottles and report back. She told a panicking woman to check on the children in the kids' zone and make sure they had blankets. She converted despair into function with the efficiency of a turbine, converting steam into electricity. On the morning of the second day, the base commander, a colonel whose name I never learned because everyone called him the colonel with a definite article that conferred mythic status, briefed the civilian refugees in the hangar. He stood on a crate. He was not a tall man. He had the compact, weathered look of someone who had been in the military long enough for the military to have become his skeletal structure. He spoke without amplification, and his voice carried. The situation is this. The continental United States, east of the Mississippi, is largely non-functional. Communication with eastern states is intermittent. Military operations are focused on holding a line along the river and evacuating survivors to western staging points. This base is being redesignated as a transit point. Within 48 hours, all civilians will be transported west, to Colorado, to bases in the mountain states, to locations that are defensible and provisioned. You will be moved. You will be fed. You will be protected to the best of our capability. He paused. The hangar was silent except for the wind against the metal walls and the distant, irregular sound from the east. I will not lie to you about conditions. The infected present a significant and evolving threat. Their numbers east of the river are in the millions. Their behavior is changing, adapting. Early infected were disorganized. Current infected demonstrate group behavior. They're drawn to sound and to light. This base maintains blackout conditions after dark for this reason. Compliance is not optional. He stepped down from the crate. A woman in the crowd, I couldn't see who, asked the question that everyone was carrying. What about the people still back east? The colonel looked at her. He did not answer immediately. The silence was not theatrical. It was the silence of a man measuring the weight of truth against the structural capacity of the people who would receive it. We're doing everything we can, he said. It was the most honest evasion I have ever heard. On the second night, the sirens sounded. One long blast. I was in the hangar. The sound hit the metal walls and multiplied into something physical, something you didn't hear so much as feel in your sternum. 300 people went from various states of restless half-sleep to absolute, electric wakefulness in under 2 seconds. Floor hatch. I shouted. Northwest corner. Move. Move now. We had drilled this. Grace and I had drilled this on the first day, walking the route, identifying the hatch, testing the ladder. 300 people through a single hatch. It was an engineering problem with a time constraint, and the time constraint was whatever was coming from the east. Grace was already there, lifting the hatch. Glenn Tully, massive, improbable Glenn, stationed himself beside it and began physically lifting people who were too slow or too frightened and lowering them through the opening like a man loading cargo, which in a sense he was, except the cargo was human and terrified, and the manifest was everyone. The children went first. Grace's daughter, Grace's son, a toddler whose parents I didn't know, 2 kids from another flight who had been traveling as unaccompanied minors and who had attached themselves to Dolores with the desperate magnetism of children who need an adult and will accept any adult who presents as competent. They went down the ladder and into the dark below, and they did not cry, which was worse than crying, because children who don't cry in situations that warrant crying have made a calculation about the utility of tears that no child should have to make. Marcus went down. He moved mechanically, his phone still in his hand, its screen still dark. He had not spoken in 6 hours. He had not eaten the MRE I'd placed beside him. He had eaten the butterscotch candy at some point. I'd seen the empty wrapper and had not replaced it with another, and the absence of the candy in his shirt pocket was a small, stupid thing that I noticed and that lodged in me like a splinter. Helen was at the back of the crowd, herding, counting, doing the thing we were trained to do, being the last ones through, the shepherds at the rear of the flock. Her earring caught the emergency lighting. She looked at me across the crowd, and her face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It settled. The anxiety, the tilt, the held back words, all of it smoothed into a surface that was either peace or resignation, and I couldn't tell which and didn't have time to ask. Gunfire outside. Not distant anymore. Close. The sound of the infected hitting the hangar walls. Not breaking through, not yet, but hitting again and again with a rhythmic, almost mechanical persistence like a washing machine on an unbalanced cycle. A domestic sound made monstrous. Helen. Now. She came. She was the last one through except for me and Glenn, who looked at me and said, "After you, miss." Even then, even at the edge, the courtesy of a man from Raleigh who held doors and said ma'am, and who believed in an order of operations that put women before men in doorways, even when the doorway was a hatch in the floor of a hangar that was about to be breached. I went down. Glenn followed. He pulled the hatch shut above him, and the metal rang, and then there was darkness and the sound of 300 people breathing in an underground space that smelled like concrete and diesel and fear. We stayed underground for 7 hours. I will not describe all of those hours because some of them are stored in a part of my memory that the therapist and I have agreed to approach slowly, the way you approach a structure that might be unsound. What I will say is this: in the dark with the sounds above us, the impacts, the gunfire, the siren that eventually stopped, the silence that was worse than the siren, I sat against the wall and I closed my eyes and I thought about Nessa. I thought about the cat she draws. The way she starts with the ears. Always the ears first, 2 triangles. And then the body, and then the tail, which curves upward in a way that no real cat's tail curves, an optimistic tail, a tail that belongs to a cat that has never been afraid of anything. I thought about her hands making that drawing. I thought about her hands. I thought about the last normal thing. The last completely ordinary thing I did before I boarded flight 1143. I've been to Charlotte Airport at the gate, and I called Nessa to say goodbye the way I always did, quick, perfunctory, the goodbye of a routine departure, a goodbye that assumed return. She'd answered and said, "Hi, Mom," and I'd said, "I'm boarding, I'll call you tonight." And she'd said, "Okay, bring me something," and I'd said, "From Chicago?" "Like what?" And she'd said, "I don't know, a deep dish pizza." And I'd said, "I'm not bringing a pizza on a plane." And she'd said, "Then what's even the point of you going?" And I'd laughed and said, "I love you, bye." And she'd said, "Bye." And that was it. That was the last normal thing. An ordinary goodbye built on the assumption of an ordinary hello. In the dark underground, I held that conversation in my mind the way Marcus held the butterscotch candy. Turning it over, feeling its edges, trying to extract something from it that would sustain me. The memory was warm. The warmth was also the source of the pain. They were the same thing. On the 3rd day, the evacuation began. The base had held. Barely. The eastern perimeter was lost, but the western half had been defended through the night by forces that had fought with a discipline I will never forget and a cost I will never fully know. The hangars nearest the breach were gone. I could see them from the tarmac, their doors open, their interiors dark, and I did not look closely at what was visible inside them. C-130 transport planes arrived from Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. Big, thunderous, utilitarian aircraft that landed with none of the grace of a commercial jet and all of the authority. Their cargo bays opened like mouths, and we filed in. Not the orderly boarding of a commercial flight, not the rows and seats and overhead bins, but a mass loading, bodies on benches and on the floor, packed in with the impersonal efficiency of people being moved as material. I sat on the metal floor of the C-130's cargo bay with my back against the fuselage. The metal vibrated. I pressed my palm flat against it. 3 pulses, then a sustained hum, then silence. A different signature than the regional jet. A different frequency, but the same principle. Metal doing what metal was asked to do, carrying weight through air, converting fuel in a distance, operating on physics that did not care about the catastrophe below. Helen sat beside me. Her phone was in her lap. She had gotten one text through to her sister's number during a brief window when a cell tower in western Indiana had flickered back to life. The text said, "Are you alive? I'm coming." The reply, which came 8 minutes later, was not from her sister. It was from her sister's phone, but the message was written by her nephew, Caleb, age 7. It said, "Mom said go west. We are in the school, the gym. She says don't come. She says go west. Joy says hi." Helen showed me the text. Her hand was steady. Her face was the face of a woman who has just received proof of life and proof of danger simultaneously, and whose relief and terror have merged into a single emotion that the English language does not have a word for. "Joy says hi," Helen whispered. The C-130 took off. Through the small porthole window nearest me, I watched Whiteman Air Force Base shrink, the hangars, the runway, the breached eastern fence, the shapes moving through the breach with that terrible, purposeless fluidity. They were already on the runway. They were walking where our wheels had been. They were occupying the space we had just vacated with the passive inevitability of water filling a hole. Then we were above the clouds and the ground was gone, and it was just sky again, just altitude, just the thin, cold air that didn't know anything about what was happening below it. We landed in Colorado Springs 7 hours later. The reception was organized, military, efficient. Buses, processing, wristbands, a gymnasium, Peterson Space Force Base's fitness center, converted into a refugee intake facility, where cots have been arranged with the geometric precision that the military applies to everything, as though the right angles and uniform spacing could impose order on the disorder that had driven us here. I stood in that gymnasium, and I looked at the cots, and I looked at the people filling them. Passengers from my flight, passengers from other flights, drivers who had made it across the river, families who had walked, a man who had ridden a horse 60 miles from Jefferson City. And I felt something that I later identified as the specific grief of a person who has survived a thing that others have not, and who cannot yet calculate the scope of the loss, because the loss is still in progress. I found a cot. I sat on it. The mattress was thin. The blanket was military issue, rough, the color of olive pits. On the cot beside mine, someone had left a clipboard with an inventory sheet, supplies, quantities, dates. I picked up the pen that was clipped to it. At the bottom of the inventory sheet, in the margin, I drew a cat. 2 triangles for ears, a round body, a tail that curved upward, optimistic, the tail of a cat that had never been afraid of anything. An airman walking past glanced at it and kept walking. He didn't ask why. I didn't explain. I still draw them. On inventory sheets, on intake forms, on the margins of the maps we use to plan supply runs. Nobody asks. I think some people have started to understand, in the way that survivors understand each other's rituals. Not through explanation, but through recognition, the way you recognize a limp and know not to ask which leg and why. Nessa's phone is still off. It has been off for 209 days. I call it every morning at 6:14. The time I was standing in the aft galley of Flight 1143 with my palm against a fuselage wall, feeling for the landing gear signature. The last moment, I was a person whose biggest problem was a man in 14C and a missed bedtime call. I call and it goes to voicemail and I hear her voice. It's Nessa, leave a message or don't. And I leave a message. Every time, I tell her where I am. I tell her what the weather is. I tell her what I ate. I tell her I'm coming to get her, even though I don't yet know how. Even though the Mississippi is a graveyard of collapsed bridges and the eastern states are a territory that the military has designated with a word I refuse to use, because using it would mean accepting a permanence I am not willing to accept. Helen left last month. East. Toward Indiana. Toward a school gymnasium where a 7-year-old boy sent a text that said Joy says hi. She took a backpack, a water filter, an old Remington 870 that Glenn Turley taught her to shoot in the scrubland behind the base, and the kind of determination that lives in the body of a woman who has heard her niece say hi through a text message and will not let that be the last communication. I wanted to go with her. She told me to wait. She said, "Your daughter needs you to be findable. If she makes it west, she needs to know where you are. Stay. Be the place she walks toward." Helen tilted her head. The earring caught the Colorado sun. She walked east, and I have not heard from her since. And I carry that silence the way I carry all the silences now, as open channels, frequencies I keep monitoring, signals I refuse to declare lost. Grace is still here. Her children are still here. Her husband's frequency, the air traffic control channel he would have used at Indianapolis Center, is silent. And Grace monitors it every night on a handheld radio that Danish rigged for her from Cockpit Salvage. She sits in the corner of the gymnasium with the radio pressed to her ear and listens to static the way a person listens to the ocean in a shell, not expecting to hear a real wave, but unwilling to stop listening. Marcus left 2 weeks after we arrived. Not east, not towards Cincinnati, just out, into the western landscape, towards something or away from everything, I don't know. He left his phone on his cot, screen cracked, battery dead. I picked it up. I put it in my pocket. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm keeping it for. Maybe the same thing I'm keeping Nessa's voicemail greeting for. Proof that these people existed, that they loved daughters named Iris who were afraid of basements, that they carried butterscotch candies in their shirt pockets, that they were real before the world made real a category that didn't include them anymore. I'm writing this at 6:14 in the morning. It's always 6:14 when I start. The gymnasium is quiet. The particular quiet of 300 people sleeping in a space not designed for sleep, a collective unconsciousness that sounds like breathing and rustling and the occasional murmur of someone negotiating with a dream. In an hour, I'll start my shift at the intake center, where new arrivals come through. Fewer now, but still some, still trickling in from the west, and occasionally, miraculously, from the east, carrying stories I collect the way I used to collect flight hours, each one a record of a journey that shouldn't have been survivable, and was. I still press my palm against walls. Any wall. Metal, concrete, drywall. I feel for vibrations. Signatures. The specific frequency of a system doing what it was designed to do. Mostly the walls are silent. But sometimes, when AC-130 lands on a runway a mile away, or when a generator kicks in after a fuel delivery, or when the intake center's ancient HVAC system coughs to life in the morning, I feel it. That pulse in the metal. That hum. The frequency of something mechanical and indifferent and reliable. Something that doesn't care about the catastrophe, but continues to function within it, converting energy into purpose, carrying weight through a medium that should not support it. That's what I do now. I press my palm against the wall, and I feel for the hum, and I call my daughter at 6:14, and I draw cats and margins, and I wait. Not passively, operationally. I organize, I distribute, I manage the gap between what people need and what is available, which is the same job I had before, just with different stakes and a different cabin and no landing scheduled. Nessa, if this reaches you, if some signal finds its way through the dead towers and the dark networks and the silence that covers everything east of the river like snow, I need you to know, I'm still here. I'm on the ground. The landing was rough, but I walked away from it, and I am walking toward you, even when I'm standing still. I'm walking toward you. Draw me a cat.